All right, so welcome to today's webinar, which is on technology, law and ethics. My name's Carly Hanson and I'm from Community Legal Centres Queensland. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding this webinar. So in Brisbane, where Community Legal Centres Queensland is based, they are the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this webinar is being viewed throughout Queensland and Australia, and our presenter is coming to us today from Melbourne, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional elders and owners of the land throughout the country and welcome any First Australians listening in today. So, as I mentioned, we're talking about technology today, and this technology space presents a wide range of opportunities and many challenges as well for community legal centres. So understanding the ethical dimensions to this kind of issue is really important. Today, we're fortunate enough to have Fabian Horton, a lecturer from the College of Law and a technology expert and CLC alumni, with us to talk about these issues. So Fabian will discuss the connections between ethics and technology and how community lawyers can contribute to this ongoing discussion. So Fabian will, I think you'll hopefully be able to see him up on the screen at the moment as well as his PowerPoints, and we'll switch over just to the PowerPoint shortly. But just a couple of housekeeping things first. So Fabian's going to ask a few questions perhaps through the presentation. So if you are happy to respond, type your answer into the question or the chat box that's on your GoToWebinar control panel so that we can make this a really robust presentation. If you've got some questions, we can also deal with them at the end as well, so feel free to type them in too. This webinar is being recorded and we'll put the recording up on our website later this afternoon for anyone who isn't able to come to the live session. And I think, the only other thing is that the handouts were emailed out to everyone who registered as of yesterday, and I'll just pop those handouts into the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel shortly. So if you haven't had a chance to download those, you'll be able to grab them from there. So I will hand over now to Fabian to present to us, and I'll pop back in as needed to read out your questions if you've got any. So thanks, Fabian.
Thank you very much, Carly. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. Welcome to this presentation. It's my honour to be here from very cold Geelong. I hope you're a little bit warmer up there in Queensland. I'll be up there again in a few weeks. I'm looking forward to that. This is about technology and the law and ethics. It's an emerging space for everyone, and in my opinion, this is probably one of the biggest spaces in which lawyers can really make an impression on the changing dynamics of not only law and their own practice, but society as a whole. When we think about ethics and how that interrelates with the law, we usually think of it along the lines of, practice and professional responsibility. But as we know, this extends a lot further into the issues in which how we might relate to our clients, how we might relate to the ways that we do our practice. We've seen a few things bouncing around in the media lately about things, that weren't really unethical, but as they say, ethics is doing what is right when nobody is looking. With technology, we see the landscape changing immensely, and a lot of the current issues were actually based on some use of technology, apps and data gathering and things like that. So we can see that this is an example of some of these emerging issues that we need to deal with. A little bit about me before I get started into the main part. I am a lawyer. I operate a virtual law firm. I also lecture at the College of Law down here in Victoria. Prior to becoming a lecturer, I worked in private and government sectors, in large law firms, in smaller law firms, and I ran a community legal centre in Mildura. Then I went to academia. I'm now just completing my PhD in the impact of technology and the law. And I find that this is such an evolving area, and it's so fascinating that once you start to get into it, you do see a lot of the links that are around that perhaps are considered a little bit sort of underground. They're a little bit difficult to see if you don't know what you're looking for. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a look at some of the issues sitting behind this domain of technology, law, and ethics. What this will enable us to do is to get an understanding of the way to think about this new area, the way that it's coming, the way that it's evolving. And once we get a mind frame, we're able to deal with some of these new issues as they emerge in a way that's holistic, that has a look at a lot of the different areas and some of them that we're perhaps not usually used to. So I'll move across now to the PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully that will then help you in understanding some of the more intricate issues that I'm discussing. Hopefully now you're just seeing the PowerPoint presentation. I was at a legal technology conference earlier this month, and there was a keynote presentation by Professor Toby Walsh from the University of New South Wales. Now, he is from the area of artificial intelligence, and he's considered, as they call him, a rock star in the area. And he was discussing some of the emerging issues that were coming along with artificial intelligence. And we all know, we've all seen the news and we all hear it in our own practices, that artificial intelligence is taking off in so many ways. His thinking on this, however, was quite interesting. This is what he had to say. Soon companies will need to employ a CPO, a Chief Philosophical Officer. Now, why would someone like that, who is so into technology, his basic area, his very fundamental area, is pushing new technology, why would he be interested, or why would he think philosophy was so important? I'm going to leave that question open. If during the time that we're speaking, you've got any thoughts, hopefully you can put them in the chat session. I'll see them, and then we'll have a discussion about this as we go forward. But the first thing that we need to consider when we are dealing with technology, law, and ethics is what it is that we actually talk about when we're talking about technology. That question in itself has a really huge impact, because if we see technology in a certain way, we will relate to the issues that it engenders in a certain way. But what we know is that technology in itself is becoming so intrinsic in the way that society works, and henceforth the way society relates to the law, and the law relates to society. So we need to have a very good understanding of what it is that we actually mean when we talk about technology. So to help us with that, we have three questions. The first question is, what is technology? Sounds pretty basic, but it's actually quite an in-depth question. The second one is technology neutral? And the third, is technology autonomous? Again, these questions are important because if we look at it in a certain way, if we have certain answers for these questions, we look at the issues in a certain way. If we come at it from another angle, the questions themselves manifest in a totally different way, and the answers that we come up with are then totally different. Let's start with the first question then. What is technology? Any thoughts? Again, if you feel like it, stick it in the chat box, and hopefully I'll see some questions coming up. Now, there are various ways in looking at the chat box. Sorry, I was just looking at it as things popped up. Excuse me on that. I'm looking at what is technology. Now, a lot of people consider technology to be the things that we hold in our hands. Everyone has a mobile phone. As I like to say, we're all androids now, or cyborgs, because we all have this piece of technology that's almost ingrained into us. And we consider this the article or the device answer to what is technology. Even things just such as, pens, paper, early tools, things like that. That's all considered as part of technology. But in essence, many of the philosophers say that this is only part of the answer. The next part that comes up is the issues of data. Now, as lawyers, we work in an information field. That's what we do. Our bread and butter is information gathering and passing it out again. So information technology in itself is very much a part of our day-to-day life. If we take that back, however, we can see that data and how it's not only how it's held and how it's stored, but how we think about it, how we deal with it, and the way that it impacts on our lives, that in itself can be seen as a form of technology. And what we see now is that we start moving away from the very specific hands-on articles, and we start to move more into the realms of thinking. The next stage that we can see is that systems are considered types of technologies. As we know, the Industrial Revolution, that started to bring out various modes of production. And then we see things like when the Model T Ford came about and how the production of the cars and other pieces of technology start to be being built. So what we have then is the data, the way that we think about how technology can be used and can be made, starts to be made into a specific system. That system then starts to engender ways in which we deal with things, we create our societies, we structure our societies. And that leads us then into what we call human systems, how we then see that the whole fabric of society can be put together. And we start to see the links between the issues of how we think about the technological. It's that technological thinking that starts to get ingrained in the way in which we look at how laws should be, or what they should protect, what we think is important, and we start to see issues such as copyright and all of those things starting to come really to prominence. So this idea of tools, data, processes, and systems needs to all be considered if you're trying to decide what type of technology you are dealing with. If you just think technology just is the things that we hold in our hands, then the way that you approach an ethical question in relation to technology might be limited just to those types of things, those tools, the types of technologies that we can sort of hold into our hands. So things like that start to deal with issues such as medical technologies, technologies with drones and things like that. If you, however, start to think that data and the way that we deal with data, the way that we deal with personal information and things, that information in itself is a type of technology, then we start to have a different outlook on how to approach these issues. This then takes us to the question of, is technology neutral? Now, this question comes up in terms of the way in which we give some sort of agency to technology. Does technology engender with us a type of determinism? What that means is, does technology affect us in a way that has a bias? Now, the idea behind this is that, can you use the technology in a way that is separated from how it was originally created? Can the technology that you have in your hands, or the processes that you use, or even the institutions that come about from all of this, are they separate and have no bias in terms of what its original creators meant for it? I understand that that's quite an abstract concept, but we see the articulation of this in a specific phrase which we all should be very aware of, which is this one: guns don't kill people, people kill people. Now, we understand that that is quite a controversial statement, that in itself that can lead to different types of laws, and we can see the whole articulation of this being played out in various countries across the world. Again, if you are of one persuasion, that the gun in itself only does a certain thing and it's only designed to do one thing, then you will think about the ethics of that in a certain way. However, if you think that it has a specific bias and that it's developed one way, then you might think about the ethical issues another way. The last question that we need to deal with is technology autonomous? What do we mean by this? By this, what we're talking about is determinism or indeterminism. It deals specifically with social change and technology's ability to drive or not the way in which we live and in which we organize ourselves as a society. If you think that technology is autonomous, then in some ways it has its own ability to not create itself per se, but to engender in us a way of thinking that it continually will develop in a certain way. If you think that it is indeterminate, then the ideas behind that is that anything can happen. The question in this is really the relationship between humans and technology. Does technology push us down a certain road? Is it because we have developed a certain technology? Let's take the guns example again. Does that mean that we will be of a certain way? Now, obviously, the issues of war and violence go back a very long way. But if we can have a look at some of the more recent issues, does the idea of social networking, since the internet came, was it determined that once we were all connected, that we would start to deal with each other online? Was it that we would become social and move so many of our interactions online? Some people say, yep, of course, once we all became connected, the ease and everything, it was inevitable that we were going to move as much as possible online. And are we now starting to see a backlash to this? Are we starting to see that technology is pushing us down a road which perhaps we're not comfortable with? And it's these sorts of questions that we can start to see taking place now with the issue of privacy and data retention and things like that. Are we being drawn into this vacuum of technology that's just like a black hole, sucking everything in, that will push us down a certain road? There are also issues such as power and control that we have to deal with here. There's a whole spectrum of determinism that links between the sort of the hard and the soft. And obviously this thing is not just a black and white. These questions all have scales of grey. The important thing, however, is to have an understanding that these three questions really do affect the way that we approach the ethical questions. And if we can just have them in the back of our mind, that will allow us to be more open to different types of answers and solutions when technology and ethics comes up. So what we can see here is just a little graph that helps us get a bit of an understanding. This will be in the handouts that come to you, and this deals with issues of determinism, whether the technology itself starts to push the way we think, or are these things all open-ended and that choice in itself is very much in control. I'm somewhere in the middle. I believe that technology in itself does engender a certain way of thinking, but however that we are autonomous agents within ourselves, and that we can start to move things in a certain way. However, I think that the technology stone is a rather heavy boulder to move. Like many things in society, once they get to a certain size, they get a gravity of their own, and it can become quite difficult. One of the early philosophers of technology, Jacques Ellul, says that technology leads a double life, one which conforms to the intentions of designers and interests of power, and another which contradicts them, proceeding behind the backs of their architects to yield unintended consequences and unintended possibilities. It's very interesting. He was coming off the back of the Second World War, so what they were seeing then was some very interesting moves in technology. Obviously, the atom bomb had just come through, so there was some pretty big questions that they were dealing with at that time in history. So bringing it back more to the questions that we need to deal with, some thought exercises for you. And again, if you can, if you have some thoughts on this, please feel free to add them into the comments section, and we can have a discussion on them. So here they are. Does Facebook change the way we relate to each other, or does the way we relate to each other determine what becomes popular in Facebook? That's a favourite question of mine. I definitely have a view on that, which I'm not going to say at this time. We might get back to it if we have some questions. That'll encourage some people to type. Has LinkedIn changed business networking? Well, I think that the answer to that is most definitely yes. Everyone now, it's pretty much the yellow pages almost of business networking. So if you are sort of at any level, you are pretty much getting on LinkedIn. The last question comes back to this idea in which we've looked at the internet as a whole. So does hyperconnectivity change the way we think? Is it because that we are now online all the time? Do we expect things differently? Do we expect that when we talk to our lawyer online, or when we send our lawyer an email, that we need to get a response back within 50 seconds because, you know, that's how long it took to write the email? Do we feel that emails in themselves are, you know, just a general way of chatting? How about Twitter? How about those types of social media? Do we have an understanding of where the private becomes the public? And now, if we have a look at some of those other questions that we are dealing with, we know that, you know, this idea of the private and public divide of our lives becomes very opaque. It's very difficult to see where that lands. So, in terms even of issues when we're trying to explain these things to our clients in relation to, say, online bullying, violence, intervention orders, those sorts of things that come our way, we see that the operation of online accounts, social media, becomes very difficult to deal with. These questions need to be answered in a certain way, and soon, I would suggest probably sooner rather than later, the authorities, the lawmakers are going to start to look at, and we already know that they have, we already know that, you know, certain orders can be made in certain ways. The next thing that we need to deal with is what we call the law-tech domains. Now, this starts to deal with the idea of what are the different ways in which the technology interacts with the law. When we have an understanding of this, we can start to see the different ways in which ethics starts to apply to the different areas. So, but before we get to that, we need to have a look at just a couple of the areas that that affect the way in which these law-tech domains are constituted. Three concepts that we deal with are hyperconnectivity, paradigm shift, and disrupt. We've talked about hyperconnectivity. The idea of paradigm shift is this movement from what we used to practice, the way we used to practice, the way we used to think about how the issues were dealt with, and how we deal with it now, sort of in this modern era. Most people forget that it was only, some 20 or 30 years ago, before computers really took hold, that the way in which we related to each other, has changed. We see this coming about in the terms of disruption. The idea of disruption was brought by Clay Christensen, and talked about the issue of a technology superseding another technology and knocking it out of the marketplace. Now we talk about technology disruption in a much more broader term, but it's still a good idea. It's a good way of talking about this idea, and it helps us understand the way in which technology starts to interact with the different legal domains. So let's get into them. There are three specifics, and I call them the disrupts. The legal code disrupt, the legal profession disrupt, and the legal culture disrupt. Now, if we start to have a look at how each of these work, we start to get an understanding of the different ways in which ethics can arise in the way that we practice, or in the way in which law and technology relate to each other. So the three law tech domains are the law of technology, the technology and legal industry domain, and the law tech culture domain. So I'm going to go through each of these quickly. The technology and legal industry domain, this is the way in which we actually practice. If we think about things like OSLI, this really disrupted the way in which we dealt with legal research and things like that. LexisNexis, Dragon, we look at these in terms of both business ways in which we operate and in terms of specific legal practice technologies. So an example in terms of this is, how do we start to integrate these technologies into our practice, and are we doing it in a way that is ethical? There's also issues in relation to ethics and competency. In America, you may have seen that the American Bar Association has released practice notes under their ethical obligations that lawyers must be competent in the way in which they deal with technology. This is a slightly different approach to the issue of ethics, but still nonetheless. This domain also deals with the way in which the industry puts together technology. We've also seen lately some issues in relation to PEXA that have been hitting the news. We've started to see the issues of, who's responsible for things such as hacking, which has happened recently. Are there issues of ethics that need to be looked at in this scenario? Also, again, the other ones that were in the news recently on the way in which the issue of claim farming has come about. This, I think, is a large ethical issue for lawyers to have to deal with, and I think that there will probably have to be some response from the legal profession in the way in which this is dealt with. This is a specific use of technology within the practice that has some ethical issues, not only in the way in which we expect a lawyer to act, but in which the community expects us to act ethically. The legal code domain deals specifically with laws relating to technology. We see this is probably the primary way in which we usually look at issues relating to law and ethics. This has been going on for an extremely long time. Pretty much any time a new technology comes about, there are issues relating to the ethics of it. The famous ones are obviously IVF and its new incarnation of this type of question, which is the new technologies in relation to artificial uterus, in which they have been successful in growing new young animals. The technology was developed to assist very, very premature births. Now, I don't think anybody would have any problem with that, saving the life of an extremely premature child into an artificial environment such as that seems on the first look as to be a very worthwhile thing. However, there are consequences of extending this type of technology to other applications which were not in the thinking of the original creators. We can see here that this starts to take us back to those types of questions. Is there an inherent bias in this type of technology? Was there a bias included or thought about when the creators of this technology built it? And this is where the philosophy part starts to come into it. This is where I believe, just one of the areas in which lawyers can start to take a really prominent role. We can start to unpick these issues, start to look at them at a deeper level. Lawyers have the ability to hopefully remove themselves from the emotional part of it and look at things objectively and get down to the nuances that sit within these issues. And then hopefully, and I believe this is where we will really make our inroads when artificial intelligence starts to take all our jobs, or at least the jobs that we do now, that we can recreate ourselves in a way that really can start to help society. And I see the areas of the community legal centres really taking a hold here, really starting to look at the social good a lot more. As we start, and I'm talking about this in obviously a broader sense, as we start to, as a society, get better and better at helping people and technology starts to take those leaps forward, we will have to start to look at how we can look at these issues in different ways. And I think that especially the community legal sector has a real role to play here. To this, we really are only at the start of this technology boom. We are hitting the what they call the fourth phase of industrialization and the third phase of artificial intelligence. So once these things are being come much more to fruition, we are going to have to start to realign what we do and how we do it. Going back to specifically the legal code domain, it's not just the laws themselves that deal with technology, but technology itself also makes its own rules. And this is where we're going to have to start to have a bit better an understanding of how technology relates to the relationship between humans. And that's, in essence, one of the main points of law, and that's to help social relationships. Technology in itself makes its rules. If you go onto a system, you have to adhere to what the programmer allows you to do. You can't go on to Facebook and I'm just trying to think of something here. You can't go onto Facebook and drive a car. Facebook, not yet. I know Facebook wants to do everything, but Facebook doesn't allow you to drive your car today, maybe tomorrow. But anyway, the idea is that you can only do on Facebook what Facebook allows you to do. Same with pretty much every piece of technology. It can only do certain things to an extent. However, that doesn't mean that it can't be reprogrammed, it can't be used in a different way. A lot of these issues obviously are dealing more with the more the more specific areas of data and information technologies and things like that. Even looking to the issues of technology as systems. But we all know, however, that systems can be perverted, and we need to be able to take a specific view of this to look at the ethical issues that start to come about. Is it that, a system of government that looks at dealing with technology in a certain way, are they using issues of power in a certain way that is not beneficial for society? So we need to have an understanding of how these things relate. Moving on then, a little bit of an animation. We see that this issue of disrupt starts to take a more nuanced approach. Some of the writers that deal with this issue are Susskind. He deals with the legal industry disrupt in his many books. The legal code disrupt is dealt with by Lawrence Lessig. If you want to have a look at these issues, then those are the two writers that I can recommend for you. The last one is our technology and law culture domain. This deals with how we now operate as a society in relation to the different issues that technology brings up. And I've given some of the some examples here, the idea of how startups develop, how they operate, the commodification of law, which is obviously a big issue for CLCs, not only in the way in which law is dealt with. We know that a lot less money is being put into the sector when a lot more money is required. Can technology, or does the way that we deal with technology, is that going to help, or is it going to hinder the work of CLCs? We could say that, well, everything is going towards online. We're going to be dealing a lot more with online. We're going to be using artificial intelligence. So a lot of those more basic types of matters can be dealt with in a different way. Is that a good idea? Do we need to start to rethink the way in which CLCs deal with the types of matters that we have? And is there an ethical obligation that we start to move to a more nuanced type of way in which we practice? The issue of therapeutic jurisprudence is taking much more precedent now, and I think that the commodification of law and legal services will hopefully, and this is just my view, will hopefully allow us to do better lawyering, because we are not spending time doing those things that that the machines can do, and we can spend more time person to person. So there's differing views of how law, and especially probably the simpler matters, are being dealt with. Other issues such as the gig economy, being agile and mobile, all have an effect on the way in which we practice, the way we think about practice, the way we think about what law should be doing. Should we be able to get onto an app and deal with a neighbourhood dispute? Why can't a lawyer be online? Why can't we have a CLC that has certain apps that allow us to just deal entirely through an app with a client? Can we bring in other professionals to help us do this? Can we have the sociologists, the medical profession, the psychologists, the technologists, and the lawyers all working together to produce these better outcomes. The tech law culture domain is one that allows us to think a little bit further outside just the law domain and start to use technology to help us be much better at what we do and be more specific in what we do so we can get better results with less money. I've just put down a couple of questions here in relation to some of the thinkings. Do we look to regulate the manufacturing of technology or its use? There are ethical questions, especially with some technologies, as we've talked about in terms of, say, medical technologies, biotechs, any of those food technologies. There are all issues here that I think lawyers are going to start to take a more prominent role. Do we take a cultural approach and use education when we're starting to look at these issues? Are there systems that can be changed or improved? And do we have the ability to look at them in a certain way that we can actually, for example, if technology is deterministic in some ways, to break out of what might be a bad road that we're on and come up with something better? We've seen these types of things when the governments want to bring in technology type solutions. The one that obviously comes to mind is robo-debt. I don't think there are many people that would disagree that it didn't work out too well in many ways, and that the CLCs probably had a lot to do with trying to assist those who got caught up with it. Is there ways in which we as lawyers can start to assist those not only who are affected by these issues, but assist those who are starting to look at the issues or start to do this sort of thing and say, you know, at the very start, you know, from an ethical point of view, this probably isn't a good idea. People in debt, they're stressed, they have, you know, all these other issues, not just debt usually. Perhaps we shouldn't be using technology in this case to do this. Perhaps as a system, we can do something totally different. These are just examples of the type of thinking that we need to put in place to assist and get better at coming up with more ethical approaches to the way in which law and technology interrelates. So to finish off, what we're going to do is have a little chat about the way in which technology and law ethics come about. There, again, it seems to be a favourite number of mine, 3 ways in which this can occur. The first is the extension by technology of known legal and ethical issues. The extension by technology of new ethical concerns that extend legal consequences. And the question of ethical oversight of emerging technologies. Let's have a quick chat about these. So the extension of ethics by technology. So this is where we have responses to an ethical question that are an ethical question that we're used to. But what we find is that when technology takes a step, it brings a new dimension to that ethical issue. In this case, the technology itself is usually incremental. And we can usually use incremental thinking to deal with the ethical issues that we are dealt with. The ethics of chasing clients, lawyers dealing with clients, or the ubiquitous ambulance chaser. That's been around for a long time. Lawyers turning up to the people's homes and things like that because they've had a friend who's at the doctor or the hospital has sent them some information. Huge ethical problems there, but we're pretty much on top of this issue. We have an understanding of the ethical obligations, but technology sort of pushes it into a bit of a new realm. So we need to be aware that technology can do that creep. It moves a little bit, and then the ethical issue becomes a little bit more blurred. Again, ethics isn't. Ethics is also about what you do when nobody's looking. The second one is the creation of new issues by technology. Now, the problems are sometimes created inadvertently and sometimes don't have any direct legal consequences. They're just ethical, but they can have specific legal consequences. When we see the large movements of technological, usually things such as medical issues, this is the type of thing that we're talking about here. Again, in vitro fertilization, when it came about, this was a brand new technology. It hadn't been dealt with before. It brought up so many legal and ethical issues that, we are still grappling with most of them. As lawyers, and especially as community legal sector lawyers, I think we have to really have our eyes wide open for these types of problems and these ethical issues. It's really, I think that the lawyers can take a vanguard in this and really be the first people to respond to unethical uses of new technologies, unethical uses of technologies. We're going to see that the government is becoming less likely to be able to do this. And in many situations, they're going to be the for want of a better word, perpetrators of the issues that are being dealt with. Lawyers really should be there to cast a light onto these issues and to help the social discussion about how to deal with them and how, if required, laws can be dealt with, or laws can be enacted or changed or updated to deal with these new ethical issues, these new legal issues as well that are created by new technologies. The last one is the oversight of emerging technological problems. The issue is that technology and culture does not develop at the same rate. We call this culture lag, and this also leads to the issues that we're talking about in terms of disrupt and paradigm shift. Sometimes the culture, what we're dealing with, is not as far ahead as the technology that we have. Probably some of the bigger questions that come in relation to this are questions in relation to autonomous drones, especially by the use of military. Can we imagine what might happen? And I think, this is the type of thing that lawyers, especially now, can start to be putting their minds to. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be having these types of questions now. If the military are using autonomous drones to kill people, to carry out operations, how long will it be till police services might start off as anti-terrorist organisations start using this type of technology? How long is it till police services, private institutions start to use technology? Should we be thinking about the ethical issues that are involved in that? Even just to the point of autonomous vehicles driving around. The latest discussion on this is saying, we're really only 5 to 10 years away for a very massive change in the way in which transport happens. Do we need to, we really should be starting to talk about these ethical issues of these emerging technologies now. And I think lawyers have to be front and center of this type of discussion so that we can not be left on the sidelines when these issues start to become prominent. The technologists, usually by their nature, will want to forge ahead. It's definitely up to a lot of the other types, the philosophers, the lawyers, sociologists, people like that, to make sure that this very fast-paced sector is still affording society it's due requirements, that it's not overstepping and making things worse for us. Even just the ethical issues of who should be replaced in terms of jobs. The automation of factories has already declined jobs in traditional manufacturing. The rise of artificial intelligence is likely to extend this destruction deep into the middle class, with only the most caring, creative, and supervisionary roles remaining. And that was by Stephen Hawkins. I was speaking recently with a supervisor of a mine in which he was reinstigating, and he said he had the ability to make the mine entirely autonomous, employ basically nobody. But he decided not to because there was a nearby town that relied on the mine. Now, in his position, he was, and the company that he worked for was totally in its rights to fully automate that mine. So he thought it as an ethical, saw it as an ethical and a sociological. I don't see why the two have to be separate. I don't think they need to be. He saw it both ecological, ethical, to make sure that that town was looked after. How long will it be? Will it be the case where we need to be giving submissions to governments to say, look, the rise of automation is happening too fast, the change in society is happening too quickly, society in itself isn't able to make allowances for this. We think that there should be laws that slow down the rate of automation in X industry and X industry and this industry. This is the type of things that lawyers will need to be getting into. And when these things start to go wrong, we will be at the coalface of dealing with these issues, and we will hopefully not have to wonder why we weren't asking these questions before the time was too late. Another quote, one more robot per 1,000 workers reduces the employment to population ratio by that amount, percentage point. In other words, look, one robot can move a lot of people out of work. I'm just using these as a specific example of the type of thinking that we need to get our heads around. I spoke about this with some employment lawyers as well, and for them, this was an extremely worrying issue. And, you know, it is just one of many in which the technology is starting to move at such a pace that we as a society are finding it difficult to comprehend. That's that paradigm shift again. And I think that as lawyers, we need to step up and be able to assist in understanding what's going on. So to reiterate those imperatives, I think that lawyers have an extremely important role to play in many ways, but also it'll be a different role. We will be looking at these issues from a point of view, hopefully that has changed, and that's where we need to have that paradigm shift. We need to be able to think differently about law's role in a hyper-connected world, especially where a lot of law may even be automated, where a lot of law gets dealt with by computers. We can see a lot of these things are being dealt with. We all know that the biggest dispute resolvers in the world are eBay and Amazon. No need for courts there. They've specifically designed it into the code of the systems to resolve these disputes. I don't think lawyers have a problem of being done out of work by robots and things like that. I think lawyers are more likely to be done out of work by systems being changed and there being no need for lawyers. The problems will be dealt with in another way and lawyers won't be involved. And I think for pretty much everyone else in the universe, they like it when the lawyers aren't involved. That's, of course, until they decide they do need lawyers. But the idea of this is that, you know, in a digital world, hopefully the computers can work out the problem before it becomes a problem. That in itself is a bigger problem to the way in which lawyers work. So in sort of reinventing ourselves, we need to start to look more closely at these emerging ethical issues and how they sit, because we don't necessarily want people who are uninformed to start to make these types of decisions, and again we end up with things such as robo-debt. And if lawyers are to be heard, we really have to start now. If we want to be part of these types of solutions, we need to start to look at these issues, we need to speak up, and we need to be part of the solution creation. Because if we don't do it now, the decisions will be made by other people. These other things will be put in place and we'll be left on the sidelines. And a lot of those ethical issues will be looked at through another lens. It might be through a technology lens, it might be through a government lens, it might be through some sort of power lens. And I think that as lawyers, we have a very deep understanding, you know, of social good, and especially from the community legal sector point of view, that we should be speaking up a lot more and making ourselves heard, not only just for our clients, but also for society at a broader level. Well, I hope that that's been interesting. I hope that you've been able to rethink some of the ways in which ethics is dealt with. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have if you wish to type, or if you wish to tweet me. I'm on Twitter, or send me an email. I'm also happy to discuss the same.
Thanks, Fabian. And just a reminder to everyone, there are two ways you can ask questions. So you can type those into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can put up your hand and we can see those hands come up and unmute you if you've got a microphone so you can ask your question verbally. So I think, you know, a lot of those questions provided hopefully a lot of really interesting food for thought, and certainly a good call to action at the end that community legal sector lawyers and others working in the space really need to be on the front foot when it comes to technology. And I think to a fair amount, for a fair amount of us, we are you know, doing some work in that space, testing the waters a little in technology, and certainly stepping up to try and assist clients where technology has adversely affected them, such as in the robo-debt situation. So Roxanne has just said, thank you very much for the informative session. If you do have any other questions, pop them through. Otherwise, you know, if you need to sort of go away, have a little bit of a think about it and a cup of tea, you can always send your emailed questions over to Fabian, and he'll, I'm sure, be very happy to answer those for you as well. Any last thoughts, Fabian, before we finish up for today?
No, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, yes, if you do have any questions, feel free to contact me in any of the usual means.
Excellent. And we've just got one last comment here that it was a really thought-provoking and useful, interesting presentation. So on behalf of, there is another question that always happens to me every time I'm about to wrap up. One question comes in, which is fabulous. So we've got here, Fabian, do you have an example of an automation that negatively impacts on a lawyer's role?
An automation. Look, I must say that I think that the way that they're looking at some of the new criminal law automations through some of the various countries is a little bit concerning. They are looking at specific sort of, they're almost automated. And they see that's an extension. So we currently have traffic tickets and things like that go through. They're looking to increase those to other issues, minor offences and things like that, where there'll probably be no person. You might just get the charge, and you'll be convicted on evidence or whatever, that's with no people involved. Those sorts of technologies are a little bit concerning. I think we need to keep an eye out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I can just add to that, just the fact that it perhaps isn't able to take into account people's personal circumstances and situations in that way that does happen now in a courtroom, and having no one really to advocate on your behalf in that respect does pose quite a few dilemmas, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that as for community sector lawyers, we need to be able to, jump up and down really early about this sort of stuff so that the ethical considerations get considered first up. And that's why Professor Walsh said, these big companies that are dealing with these things really need to have philosophy type people so they can start to think much more broadly about the issues.
All right. On that note, I think we might wrap it up for today. So on behalf of everyone who tuned in and is wildly clapping their hands at their computers or perhaps scratching their heads and thinking of where to next for them and for technology, thank you very much for presenting today, Fabian. It was a really great presentation with lots of really interesting and thought-provoking questions and scenarios. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So I will just remind everyone to please keep an eye on your emails for the feedback survey that will be sent out this afternoon, as well as the link to the recording once we've got it up on our website. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.